This is the final stage of the Rosa Sweet wrapper drawing. We've done shape, we've done detail, and now we're going to add the tone. So you should have a drawing that looks something like this. What we're aiming to achieve by the end of it is a drawing that looks something like this. So you can see here where I've added dark tone, mid-tone and light tone, so that it shows the reflection on the wrapper in the image. This is a very slow process. You need to really take your time in order to have a really good quality finished piece. So this probably will take you 45 minutes to an hour to do. So let's get started. So the first thing you want to do is look at the image and try to identify the darkest tone first. So the part that's standing out in my eye is this line along here, which also comes up here and some of the dark tones here, but this line here is really standing out for me. So I'm going to start by adding that in. And what you can see is I've already drawn that basic line, but I need to thicken it up in places and obviously shade it in. Okay, so I just make sure I do that the right side of this line. Just going to get rid of that initial line. So I've just sharpened my HB pencil, and it really needs to be nice and sharp when we're trying to put in this really accurate work here. And when you're shading, you're pressing really firmly. You've got really small, short strokes. That means that we're never trying to shade a huge area all in one go, because that's when we get streaks. I'm just going to follow this along, always looking 80% of the time looking up at the image, 20% of the time actually making marks on my page and looking down. Just going to make sure that we've got this line drawn in. You'll see it gets narrower here, so it comes down, it comes all the way down around to here. Do have a 4B pencil available, and I'll talk to you about that later. You don't have to have one of those, but if you do, I'll show you how you can use it. I've left a tiny little gap here in my shading because there is a very fine lighter shade of line just inside that dark part of tone. So just try not to shade everything in. We really get looking very closely at the details now. If you're able to reproduce this level of detail, it's really going to make for a fantastic finished piece. Again, here we've got one dark line and then a mid-tone and then the dark line again. So I'm just going to try to put a thin line across, leave a gap, which we can shade in a mid-tone later on. As it comes around the corner, once again it gets a bit narrower as it heads down. A couple of little gaps in here. Okay, so I'd say that that's it's a darker tone line, and We're next going to work on the next shade down, so also a dark tone, but a little bit lighter. We'll call it the mid-tone, just so that we can remember what it is. So the mid-tone, we're going to do some lines here. These parts here, I would suggest a mid-tone as well. Okay, so let's. Now this part of the wrapper is quite complicated. It has the grooves from where the wrapper is heat sealed. There's lots and lots of fine lines there. You are going to need to take your time with that. But what we'll do first is we'll work along the top. And then I'm going to just do this curved part here. Draw that in. And then work a line down here. Adding the second line curve here. So I'm pressing quite firmly, but I'm not pressing as firmly as I did in this line along here. Always best to work a little bit less firm, so lighter hand than you maybe think you need in the first instance, because you can always go over. It's harder if you've pressed really hard to obviously take that back. Right, we're getting to a point where we're going to now do a much larger area of shading. This part here is a mid-tone. We're going to shade that all, and that's a relatively flat tone. At this point, if you happen to have a softer pencil, something like a 2B or a 4B, which I have here, you might want to use that bit. The trick is to keep it really sharp, and it might be that you use a sharper HB at the edges to just make the edges crisp. Now, the reason why you might want to use one of these pencils is because they're softer. They give you a darker tone naturally without adding as much pressure. The other thing is that you won't find the sort of scratchy, hard kind of edges to your shading. It's just a little bit easier because it's softer to make sure that you get a nice flat tone that blends together and you don't get the pencil stroke marks. However, for many of you, you'll just have an HB pencil. Not a problem, because the last example I did, just bring that back again really quickly. This one I did the entire thing in HB, so you can still get a good result. But you'll just notice the difference between here, maybe you can see a few of the stroke marks, and in here particularly, than what I'm managing to do now with this HB. In the interest of making sure the video doesn't go on for hours and hours, I'm working a little bit quicker than what I normally would do. So it might be that you need to pause the video whilst you're working and restart it once you've completed this section. That makes sense. So I'm perhaps going a little bit quicker, but also obviously I've done this quite a few times before, so it's easier for me to make sure I'm getting a flat tone because I've practiced it. So take your time, there's no rush. Just need to make sure I haven't quite drawn in all the detail here, so I'm just going to come back to my HB, make sure that I've got a very thin gap here for the light tone, and then I can shade up to that line. Okay, so pretty happy now I've completed that part. And what you'll notice is it is ever so slightly lighter along the edge here, and it comes down just at this point around there. It comes down to that sort of mid-tone that we've been working on. So what I'm going to do is, just to finish off just this section, just release the pressure whilst I'm shading that. I mean, it's so minimal you can probably not even see it on the video, but just want that top part to not be quite so dark, like so. Okay, happy, looking good so far. We've now got to do the other side, which is a little more complicated because it's got a few more lines in it, but that's fine. We can work on that, I'm sure. Haven't drawn in all of the details here. I've realised that I've drawn this part, but I have missed out this small line here. So I'm just going to, before I start the shading, I'm going to add that in, and I can see that it touches this edge here, so that's a good place to start. And it comes up, and it's got a little sort of fork at the top, comes down to the bottom. So it's a really different, when you're shading something that's shiny, it's a very different prospect to shading a matte object. A matte object, the light and dark would just blend from one to the other. A shiny object has very, very distinct clear lines between it. And that's why we almost need to outline all of our parts of our shading before we start shading, because this really helps to make sure we get it as neatly and as accurately as we can. So what I've done here is I'm just drawing a line, kind of shows where that lighter part at the top is. And then we've got our R here. What I want to do is just add in around the side. We've got a darker stripe here, a second stripe coming up, and a third one. We'll see how we get on with that. It's very, very detailed now. So even if you're doing 80% of this amount of detail, it'll still be a good, really good drawing. Okay, so I'm shading now this mid-tone in between this part and this part. So I'm going to come down and do this line first. Notice I switch back to my 4B pencil. Doesn't matter if you've got an HB, just take your time. Okay, turn the corner there, working back up. between the little fork and up to that edge where before it starts to get lighter. So that's that section. Now going to do this line down here. So moving over to the other side of this reflection that I've already drawn in as an outline. Now that we're doing shading, you'll notice that I am resting my hand on the page because I have to work in a much smaller, more accurate way, which is fine. Just be aware that you're going to get pencil on your hand, and so you want to try and avoid resting heavily too much on the drawing part. And in fact, if I was really sensible, the top tip for you next time, let's just draw that line in first, concentrate on what I'm doing. The top tip for you next time would be to work from the left to the right if you're right-handed, to work from the right to the left if you're left-handed, and then you're never going to get the shading smudging on your hand. I haven't done it like that this time because what I wanted to do is work on the dark tone first, identify all the dark tone, then on the mid, then on the light, just because I think that that's easier when you're learning from me. Okay, so all looking good. I'm just going to add a little bit of this dark tone that's in between these lines in here. Like so. Great. Okay, next dark tone, mid-tone is going to be this middle section here. What you'll see is there's a very faint light tone line as a gap between the line at the darkest tone that I've already added in. So I'm going to just draw that in just so I don't accidentally shade over that. Like so. And there we go. As you're doing this stage, if you notice anything that's slightly in the wrong place, by all means rub it out and move it. That's what normally would happen. There's a couple of little bits I've spotted here, but I'm happy that it's accurate enough, so I'm going to keep working through it. Okay, now we've got to this point, the mid-tone does just slightly blend up to a lighter tone at this point, so we're just going to work horizontally so we get a nice smooth edge to it. And as I'm working upwards, I'm just releasing the pressure of my hand so that it just naturally turns into a lighter tone. Just slightly. Good. Okay, so next panel of mid-tone is this side panel here. Just blocking in the area around the Cadbury logo, leaving, I'll come back to do the edges more accurately, but it's just blocking in that area more quickly. Like so, and then just come back and we'll do the more detailed parts. So working around lettering, some of the lettering has a slightly darker outline. So I'll just shade up to where you've already drawn the Cadbury's logo. And we'll come back and notice that the Cadbury logo has a slightly dark outline printed. So we'll come back and do that. Okay, and here's when we make sure we've got a really sharp pencil. In fact, I'm just probably going to swap back to my HB just because I know it's got a really sharp pencil. I'm going to try and work carefully around the outline. Okay. And some of this lettering, you'll see this is the beginning of the Roses logo, I think, again, that's been printed on the underside of the wrapper. Like so. Okay, we are getting there nicely. Let's just address where we're going to go next. I think we need to do some of the darker lines on this side. So we've got as far as that. We need to do some of these lines here. And because they're very thin, I'm actually going to change back to HB. It's tempting with lines like this to pick up your ruler. Try to do it freehand. I think a ruler line will show up. It'll just stick out. It'll be different. It'll look weird in comparison to all your other hand-drawn lines. So you've got this printed part that comes around here that's darker. So you can draw that sort of edge like so. And then these lines are a bit darker here. Like that. Okay, good. That's all light tone on the side, so we can leave that for now. Let's come back to this side. Let's draw in this curved line here. Like that. And we've got a number of these lines that are very close together to draw. Like so, and then these are lighter. Like that. We're going to do the strip across the top. So always make sure that you work your shading along with the shape. So flat along here, then move your hand so that it's always, you're never sort of doing it at a completely random angle. You're always trying to imagine the shape of this wrapper and trying to imagine that you're, you know, basically your pencil is following that shape. It's stroking along the lines of that shape, if that makes sense. Okay, so we've just got to work around these really fiddly little bits here. May just change my pencil again there. So those of you that have worked in HB for the entire time, you're going to find it easier just to do this part. Not too bad. Another little line here that I've just spotted that I want to add in before we do the light tone, the final stage. It's always good to take a break from a drawing Go and get a glass of water, come back, have a look at it, stand up, look at it directly from above, blur your eyes. All these techniques can help you just to look at it afresh, identify any issues in it. For example, I feel that my initial dark line here is perhaps a little too, the difference between this line and this panel is a little bit too great. There perhaps shouldn't be such a difference. Maybe this panel needs to be a bit darker. So these are all the things that I could fix if I take a bit more time over it. Okay, so light tone is the last stage, and I would always recommend doing that last on a drawing like this anyhow. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to really lightly and gently work over these light tone panels. So the light tone I'm talking about is everything except for the roses and the Cadbury's logo, because those are the absolute lightest tones, i.e. they are white. Okay, but everything else should have just the slightest tone on it. Okay, so I'm working over because we've done a good job of putting in all our dark tones and mid tones and left these spaces for the light tone. This part is actually quite quick because we can shade over almost all of it really, except for the roses logo. Again, going a bit quicker than I would normally, just to speed things up for you a bit. Take time. There we go. Over here. These parts, if you want to try and flatten out that tone a bit, you can smudge slightly. Just be careful if you're smudging, because when you're drawing very shiny things, as I keep saying, the tone should be very crisp. You get these very crisp distinctions between, because of the reflections on the wrapper. So you don't want to smudge out any of that crispness. Okay, so just be careful about that. And you equally really definitely don't want to smudge any tone at all into your white lettering. Okay, so if you think there's accidentally you've smudged it as you've been working, which would be understandable, you can always take a rubber to it, just adjust it slightly. Right, we're nearly there. The final stage that I would do is, if you have a little look at the roses lettering, you'll see that it has actually got a dark outline around it. And so this does require some care and a bit more time. I would finish the drawing off by going around the carefully with a very, very sharp pencil. Just help it to pop out as it does on the lettering, sorry, on the packaging. Not bad. Okay, so there we go. We have our completed roses sweet wrapper. Hope you've enjoyed learning how to do that.